the word she threw across the table. There is a specific kind of silence that falls over a dinner table right after someone says something cruel out loud, thinking it's clever. That silence lasted exactly 4 seconds at my in-laws' table that night. I counted them, because in those 4 seconds, I decided something that would change the rest of my life. My name is Julia. I'm 36 years old. And that night, sitting at a table set with my mother-in-law's good china, my sister-in-law Veronica looked directly at me, smiled the kind of smile that isn't really a smile at all, and said, "It must be hard being married into this family when you come from nothing." She said it lightly, like a joke everyone was supposed to laugh at. A few people at the table actually did. My husband, Daniel, stayed quiet, staring down at his plate like the tablecloth had suddenly become fascinating. I didn't say anything back in that moment. I just smiled, picked up my glass of water, and took a slow sip, the way you do when you need 3 extra seconds to decide whether a fight is worth having. I want to tell you something important right here at the start of this story, because it matters for everything that comes after it. Veronica had no idea, sitting there in her designer dress with her diamond tennis bracelet catching the light every time she gestured, that the house we were sitting in that very night, the beautiful 5-bedroom house her own brother had been bragging about for 2 years, actually belonged to me. Not to Daniel, not to the family, to me. Every square foot of it purchased outright in my name before I had even met Daniel. She had spent an entire dinner calling me poor, in the house I owned outright, while she was still renting a 1-bedroom apartment across town and driving a leased car she couldn't actually afford. I didn't correct her that night. I let her keep talking. I let her enjoy her moment, because I already knew something she didn't. That moments like that one always come back around, and when they do, the person who stayed quiet usually ends up holding all the power. This is the story of how I built a life quietly, how a family underestimated me for years because I never bothered correcting them, and how one dinner, one careless insult, finally set in motion the exact kind of reckoning Veronica never saw coming. The girl who learned to build quietly. To understand why I sat so calmly through that insult, you need to understand where I actually came from, and why I never talked about it at family dinners. I grew up in a small town, raised by a single mother who worked 2 jobs to keep our lights on. We didn't have much. I remember exactly what it felt like to watch my mother count coins on our kitchen counter at the end of the month, praying they'd stretch far enough to cover whatever bill was due next. I promised myself something very specific during those years, sitting at that same worn kitchen table doing my homework by a single overhead light we kept dim to save on the electric bill. I promised myself that one day I would build something entirely my own, something no one could ever take away from me, and something I would never, ever have to explain or justify to anyone. I got a scholarship to a state university. I studied finance, mostly because I was drawn to the idea of understanding money deeply enough that it would never again control me the way it had controlled my childhood. I worked 2 part-time jobs through college, graduated with almost no debt, and took my very first entry-level job at an investment firm, making barely enough to survive in a small studio apartment. But I saved. I saved obsessively, the way only someone who grew up genuinely afraid of empty cabinets can save. I lived far below what I actually earned, year after year, watching my coworkers spend their bonuses on vacations and designer bags, while I quietly funneled mine into investment accounts I checked religiously every single week. By the time I was 28, through disciplined saving and a series of smart, patient investment decisions, I had built enough to make a down payment on a small starter condo. I lived in that condo for 3 years, continuing to save aggressively, continuing to invest, continuing to build something that belonged entirely to me. At 31, I sold that condo for a solid profit and used everything I had built to purchase, outright, in cash, a 5-bedroom house in one of the most desirable neighborhoods in the city. I want you to sit with that for a moment, the way I've had to sit with people's assumptions about me for years since. A woman who grew up counting coins on a kitchen counter had, entirely through her own discipline and patience, purchased a house outright by the age of 31, with no mortgage, no cosigner, no family money behind her. I met Daniel about a year after I bought that house. The man who never asked the right questions. Daniel and I met at a mutual friend's engagement party. He was charming in an easy, effortless way, the kind of charm that comes from growing up comfortable and never once having to fight for anything. He came from a family with old money, the kind that gets discussed in hushed, respectful tones at country clubs. When Daniel first saw my house, he assumed, almost immediately, that it must have come from family money on my side, or perhaps a generous inheritance. I never corrected that assumption, and looking back, I think that was my first real mistake in this entire story. It wasn't dishonesty, exactly. It was more like an old habit I'd carried since childhood, the habit of staying quiet about money, of never fully explaining myself, because explaining myself as a child had so often meant exposing exactly how little we had. I simply never got in the habit of correcting people's assumptions, even the flattering ones. Daniel and I dated for 2 years before we got married. During that entire time, he never once asked me a direct question about how I'd actually purchased the house. He simply assumed, and I simply let him. We got married in a modest ceremony, modest by his family's standards, at least, though it felt perfectly lovely to me. His family, from the very beginning, treated our marriage as though Daniel had done me a significant favor by marrying me, as though I had somehow married up into money and status I could never have accessed on my own. I let them believe that too, for longer than I probably should have. Daniel's mother, Patricia, was polite to me in the careful, distant way people are polite to someone they've already decided doesn't quite belong. She asked questions about my background at family gatherings that were technically friendly, but always carried a slight undertone of curiosity about exactly how far I'd had to climb to reach her son's level. And then there was Veronica, Daniel's younger sister, 29 years old at the time, beautiful, sharp-tongued, and deeply insecure in ways she covered up by making sure everyone around her felt slightly smaller than she did. Veronica had never worked a traditional job in her life. She'd bounced between a few failed business ventures her parents had quietly funded, each one ending the same way, with Veronica blaming market conditions, or bad partners, or timing, never herself. She lived in a rental apartment her parents helped subsidize, drove a leased luxury car she genuinely couldn't afford on her own, and had built her entire identity around appearing wealthier than she actually was. From the very first time we met, Veronica made small, pointed comments about my background. Nothing overt enough to cause a scene, just small cuts, delivered with a smile, the kind designed to remind me exactly where she believed I ranked in this family. I let every single one of those comments go, for 5 years. 5 years of small cuts. I want to walk you through what those 5 years actually looked like, because I think it matters not just the dinner where everything finally came to a head, but the long, slow accumulation that led there. At our engagement party, Veronica had loudly told a group of her friends that Daniel was marrying a bit of a fixer-upper, a comment about my modest wardrobe at the time, delivered just loud enough for me to hear from across the room, then followed by a wide, innocent smile in my direction when our eyes met. At our wedding, she gave a toast that, on the surface, sounded warm and affectionate, but was carefully constructed to remind every single guest in that room that I hadn't grown up with money the way the rest of the family had. She used the phrase, coming from humble beginnings, 3 separate times, each time glancing my way with what I can only describe as performative sympathy. At holiday dinners, she made a habit of subtly correcting my table manners, my wine choices, my clothing, always in this light, joking tone that made it nearly impossible to call out directly without appearing overly sensitive. When our first daughter was born, Veronica commented, in front of the entire family, that she hoped I'd learn how to properly furnish a nursery this time, a jab at the fact that I'd decorated our first nursery myself, on a modest budget, rather than hearing the expensive interior designer Veronica herself used for everything. I absorbed every single one of these comments quietly, partly because I genuinely didn't want to cause family conflict for Daniel's sake, and partly If I'm being completely honest with you, because some small, old part of me, the part still shaped by a childhood of counting coins on a kitchen counter, still believed, somewhere deep down, that maybe she was at least partially right about me. Daniel rarely intervened during any of this. When I brought it up privately, he would tell me that Veronica didn't mean anything by it. That's just how she is, that I shouldn't take it so personally. He genuinely seemed to believe this. I don't think Daniel ever fully understood how many small cuts had accumulated over 5 years, because he had simply never been on the receiving end of a single one of them himself. I kept building my own financial world quietly during those same 5 years, completely separate from any of it. I continued investing. I started a small consulting business on the side, working with young women trying to build their own financial independence, something deeply personal to me, given my own history. That business grew steadily, quietly, without any fanfare, until it was generating a genuinely significant income entirely under my own name. Daniel knew about my consulting work in a general sense, but I don't think he ever fully grasped how successful it had actually become, because I never made a habit of discussing specific numbers with him. Some old instinct in me had learned, from a very young age, that talking about money openly with people invited exactly the kind of judgment I'd spent my entire adult life trying to escape. By the time of that fateful dinner, I was worth, on paper, significantly more than the combined net worth of Daniel's entire immediate family, including his parents. Not one single person at that table had any idea. The dinner where it all came out. The dinner in question happened on a Sunday evening, at Patricia and her husband Richard's house, a gathering that had become a fairly standard monthly tradition for the extended family. Veronica had recently gone through the failure of her third business venture, a boutique clothing line that had folded after less than a year. She was, understandably, in a fragile emotional state that evening, though fragile for Veronica had always manifested as sharper, more pointed comments toward everyone around her rather than any visible vulnerability. The conversation that night had turned, as it often did at these dinners, toward real estate. Richard mentioned that home prices in our particular neighborhood had risen significantly over the past few years, and someone at the table, I don't even remember who, made an offhand comment about how fortunate Daniel and I were to own our house in such a desirable area. That comment seemed to strike a nerve in Veronica, sitting there fresh off her third failed business, still renting an apartment she couldn't fully afford on her own. She looked across the table at me, that particular smile forming on her face, and said the words that would end up changing everything. "It must be hard, being married into this family when you come from nothing." She said it lightly, almost affectionately, the way you deliver a joke among close friends. A few people around the table actually laughed, that uncomfortable kind of laugh people give when they're not entirely sure if something is meant as humor or an actual insult, and they're hedging their bets by laughing either way. I felt every eye at that table shift toward me, waiting to see how I'd react. I looked at Veronica for a long moment. I thought about 5 years of small cuts. I thought about the wedding toast, the nursery comment, the countless little reminders of exactly where she believed I ranked in this family. And then I thought about something else entirely, the house we were sitting 15 minutes away from at that exact moment, purchased outright by me, years before I had ever even met her brother. I smiled, picked up my water glass, and took a slow sip. "You know," I said finally, my voice completely calm, "it's interesting you'd say that, Veronica, sitting here talking about real estate." Something in my tone must have shifted the room's energy, because I noticed Daniel's head lift slightly from his plate. "What do you mean?" Veronica asked, still smiling, though something behind her eyes had flickered with the first hint of uncertainty. "I mean," I continued, keeping my voice light and pleasant, the exact same tone she'd used on me for 5 straight years, that the house Daniel and I live in, the one everyone at this table has complimented so many times, I purchased that outright, in cash, in my own name, 3 years before I ever met your brother. The table went completely silent. "That's not," Veronica started, then stopped, glancing quickly at Daniel for confirmation, as though hoping he'd correct me. Daniel, to his credit, simply nodded slowly. "It's true," he said quietly. "Julia owned the house before we even met. I've just never really talked about it, I guess." I watched something complicated move across Veronica's face in that moment, confusion first, then a kind of scrambling recalculation, as 5 years of casual condescension suddenly collided with information that completely inverted everything she'd assumed about our relative positions in this family. "But you never," she started again, her voice noticeably smaller now than it had been 30 seconds earlier. "I mean, you never said anything." "You never asked," I said simply. "You just assumed. For 5 years, you assumed, and I let you because honestly, Veronica, I didn't think I owed you a financial explanation of my own life." What happened in the silence? I want to pause the story here for a moment, because I think it's important to explain exactly why I chose that particular moment to finally say something, after 5 years of staying completely silent. It wasn't really about the house. It was never really about the money at all, not fundamentally. It was about a much simpler, much older feeling, the feeling of being underestimated, repeatedly, by someone who had never once bothered to actually know me, because it was more comfortable for her to assume I was exactly what she needed me to be in order to feel superior. I had spent 5 years absorbing small comments about coming from nothing, about being a fixer-upper, about humble beginnings, all while quietly building something far more substantial than Veronica had ever managed to build on her own, despite starting with every possible advantage handed directly to her. That night, sitting at that dinner table, something in me simply refused to absorb one more comment. Not out of anger exactly, more out of a quiet, settled certainty that I had genuinely earned the right to stop shrinking myself for other people's comfort. The silence that followed my explanation stretched on for what felt like a very long time, though it was probably only 10 or 15 seconds in reality. Patricia, Daniel's mother, was the first to speak. "Julia," she said carefully, "why didn't you ever mention this?" I looked at her directly. "Honestly, Patricia, because for 5 years, this family made it very clear, in dozens of small ways, that you'd already decided who I was before I ever had the chance to correct that impression. I stopped bothering to correct it because I didn't think anyone here was actually asking out of genuine curiosity. I thought they were asking to confirm what they already believed." Richard cleared his throat awkwardly. Daniel reached over and took my hand under the table, a small gesture, but one that told me he finally, fully understood exactly how much I had absorbed silently over the years on his family's behalf. Veronica sat frozen for a long moment, her earlier confidence completely drained from her posture. When she finally spoke again, her voice had lost every trace of its earlier lightness. "I didn't know," she said quietly. "I genuinely didn't know any of that." "I know you didn't," I said, and I meant it, without cruelty. "That's actually the whole point, Veronica. You never asked. You built an entire narrative about who I was based on nothing but assumptions, and then you spent 5 years treating that narrative as though it were established fact." The weeks after the dinner. I want to be honest with you about what happened in the weeks following that dinner, because it wasn't the dramatic, satisfying reckoning you might expect from a story like this one. It was messier, quieter, and far more complicated than that. Veronica didn't apologize immediately. I hadn't really expected her to. People who have built years of behavior around a particular assumption about someone else don't usually correct course overnight, no matter how thoroughly that assumption gets shattered in a single dinner conversation. What did happen, though, was a subtle but unmistakable shift in how the entire family began treating me. Patricia started asking me genuine questions about my consulting business, questions that carried real curiosity rather than the careful, distant politeness she'd offered for years. Richard, at the next family gathering, actually asked my opinion on a real estate investment he was considering, something he had never once done in 5 years of knowing me. Daniel and I had several long, honest conversations during those weeks, conversations that had been overdue for a very long time. He apologized, more than once, for not standing up more firmly against his sister's comments over the years. He admitted, somewhat painfully, that he'd underestimated how much those small cuts had actually cost me, because he genuinely believed I was simply choosing not to be bothered by them. I told him the truth. I told him that I'd absorbed those comments quietly for 5 years, partly out of habit, and partly because some old, wounded part of me had genuinely wondered, for a long time, if Veronica might be at least partially right about where I actually belonged in this family. That conversation, more than the dinner itself, ended up being the real turning point of this entire story. Because it forced both Daniel and me to finally have an honest reckoning with exactly how much silence we had both allowed to accumulate over the years, and exactly what that silence had actually cost. About 6 weeks after the dinner, Veronica reached out and asked if we could meet, just the two of us, for coffee. I agreed, mostly out of curiosity about what she actually wanted to say. The conversation over coffee. Veronica looked different when I met her that afternoon. Smaller, somehow, though not in any physical sense. Something in her usual armor of easy confidence had visibly cracked. "I've been thinking a lot," she said, turning her coffee cup slowly in her hands rather than looking directly at me, "about why I've spent so many years saying the things I've said to you." I stayed quiet, letting her continue at her own pace. "I think," she said slowly, "I think I needed you to be beneath me somehow, because my whole life I've had every advantage handed to me, and I've still managed to fail at basically everything I've tried. 3 failed businesses, still renting an apartment at 29 that my parents helped pay for, and then you show up from actual nothing and somehow you've built something real, something that works. I think some part of me needed to believe you'd gotten lucky, or married into it, because the alternative that you'd simply worked harder and smarter than I ever have was too uncomfortable to sit with." I sat with that honesty for a long moment before responding. "I appreciate you saying that," I told her, and I genuinely did. "But I want you to understand something too, Veronica. 5 years of small comments dressed up as jokes still cost something real. Even if you didn't fully understand why you were doing it at the time, the impact was still very real for me." "I know," she said quietly. "I'm sorry. I don't think sorry really covers 5 years, but it's what I have." I nodded slowly. "It's a start," I said, "but I think the real question now is what you do differently going forward, not just with me, with yourself." She looked up at me then, something genuinely curious crossing her face. "What do you mean?" "I mean," I said carefully, "that the pattern you're describing, needing other people to be smaller so you can feel adequate, that's not actually about me at all. That's about you, and whatever you actually believe about your own worth. Tearing me down for 5 years didn't build you a single successful business. It didn't pay your rent. It just made you feel temporarily better while the real problem sat there completely unaddressed." Veronica was quiet for a long time after that. When she finally spoke again, her voice was smaller, more honest than I'd heard it in the entire 5 years I'd known her. "Would you ever consider," she asked hesitantly, "helping me figure some of this out? The business stuff, I mean. You clearly know things I don't." I thought about that request for a long moment. Part of me, if I'm being fully honest, wanted to say no, wanted to protect the boundary I'd finally established after years of absorbing her cruelty in silence. But another part of me recognized something in her request that I understood deeply, from my own history. "I'll think about it," I told her honestly. "But Veronica, if we do this, it has to actually be different between us. No more small comments. No more jokes about where I came from. I'm not interested in helping someone who's still going to treat me the way you have for 5 years." "I understand," she said. "I really do want it to be different." What actually changed? I did eventually agree to help Veronica, though slowly, and with clear boundaries in place from the very beginning. I want to be honest with you, this wasn't some instant, movie-style transformation. Veronica didn't become a completely different person overnight, and I didn't magically forget 5 years of accumulated small cruelties simply because she apologized once over coffee. But something did genuinely shift between us over the following year. I helped her think through the actual financial mechanics of a new, much more modest business venture, one built on realistic numbers, instead of the inflated confidence that had sunk her previous 3 attempts. I taught her some of the same disciplined saving and investing principles that had built my own financial foundation, years earlier, at a kitchen table very different from the ones she'd grown up around. It wasn't easy for her. Veronica had spent 29 years being handed things, and learning to build something slowly, with real patience and discipline, was a genuinely difficult adjustment for her. There were setbacks. There were moments where old patterns of entitlement and impatience resurfaced. But there were also real moments of growth. The first time her small new venture turned an actual profit modest, nothing dramatic, but entirely her own, she called me, practically in tears, and told me it was the first time in her entire life she'd built something without her parents' money behind it. Our relationship, over that following year, transformed into something neither of us could have predicted at that dinner table. Not close friends, exactly, at least not immediately, but something genuinely respectful, built on honesty rather than assumption, for the first time since I'd known her. Patricia and I grew closer as well during that same period. She started confiding in me about her own complicated history with money and status within Richard's family, a history I'd never known about, largely because I'd never been given the chance to actually know her beyond the careful, distant politeness she'd maintained for years. Daniel and I, too, came out of that entire experience with a stronger, more honest marriage than we'd had before. We talked more openly about money, about family dynamics, about the silent weight I'd been carrying for years without him fully understanding it. He became noticeably more protective of me at family gatherings, quicker to interrupt any comment that carried even a hint of the old condescension. The lesson I carry forward. I think about that dinner often, even now, more than a year later. Not with anger anymore, that particular emotion faded fairly quickly once the immediate shock of the moment passed. What I carry forward instead is something closer to clarity about a pattern I think a lot of people, especially women, fall into without fully realizing it. For 5 years, I let other people's assumptions define how small I made myself in a room. I had built something genuinely remarkable, a life of real financial independence, built entirely through my own discipline and patience, starting from a childhood where I watched my mother count coins on a kitchen counter. And instead of standing in that accomplishment with confidence, I let a room full of people who had never once had to fight for anything convince me, through nothing but careless comments, that I somehow ranked beneath them. I want to be clear about something, because I think it matters deeply to this story's real lesson. The reveal at that dinner table wasn't really about the house, or the money, or proving Veronica wrong in some dramatic, satisfying way. The real lesson was about the 5 years that came before it, the 5 years I spent absorbing small cruelties silently, because some old, wounded part of me still half believed I needed to earn my place at that table. I don't believe that anymore, and I think that's the real transformation this story is actually about. If you're listening to this tonight, and some part of you recognizes that same pattern, shrinking yourself quietly in rooms where people have decided, without ever actually asking, exactly who you are and where you belong, I want you to hear something clearly. You do not owe anyone a financial explanation of your own life. You do not owe anyone proof of your own worth, delivered on their timeline, in their preferred format. But you also don't have to keep absorbing small cuts silently, year after year, simply to preserve someone else's comfort at the cost of your own dignity. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do isn't a dramatic reveal at a dinner table. Sometimes it's simply deciding, quietly and firmly, that you're finished shrinking yourself for people who never once bothered to actually know you. If this story moved you tonight, I want you to remember one thing before you go. The people who underestimate you are usually revealing far more about their own insecurities than they are about your actual worth. Build quietly if you need to, but don't let anyone's assumptions convince you to shrink yourself smaller than the life you've actually built. If you enjoyed this story, please take a moment to like this video, drop a comment and let me know your thoughts, and share it with someone who might need to hear it today. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to Calm Girl Stories for more real, emotional stories about strength, quiet power, and the moments that finally set the record straight. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in the next story.